In the heart of Lagos, where the sun baked the earth into cracks and the air smelled of dust and fried plantains from street vendors, Aisha walked barefoot with her two children, Musa and Zainab, trailing behind her like tired shadows. Their clothes were faded and patched in uneven squares, evidence of countless attempts to stretch fabrics that had long outlived their purpose, and their stomachs groaned with a hunger that had learned to wait but not to forgive. Aisha had once been a seamstress with a tiny shop by the corner of Balagan Market, her hands dancing gracefully with needles and thread, but when her husband died in a road accident and her landlord seized the shop due to unpaid rent, her world collapsed like a house built on wet sand. Since then, every day had become a battle for scraps, a battle she fought not for herself but for the two pairs of hopeful eyes that looked to her as though she were both savior and soldier. That Sunday afternoon, the streets were busier than usual, with wealthy families dressed in fine Ankara prints returning from church, their laughter floating above the noise of traffic like songs from another planet. Aisha's stomach twisted as she saw trays of steaming jollof rice being carried into big compounds guarded by men in crisp uniforms, but she quickly lowered her gaze. Her pride was fragile, and she hated how hunger made it feel like glass. Musa, who was 8, clutched her hand and whispered, "Mama, can we ask someone today?" His voice cracked, the desperation of a child who had grown tired of pretending that hunger was a game. Zainab, only 6, carried their last possession, a rusty tin plate that once held groundnuts, and hugged it to her chest like a talisman. "We'll find something," Aisha muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. She had heard of a new restaurant on Victoria Island, one that served food so plentiful people left half of it untouched. She had also heard whispers that the owner, a reclusive millionaire named Chief Adewale, sometimes gave leftovers to charity, though she doubted someone so rich even knew women like her existed. Still, with nowhere else to turn, she led her children across the bridge that separated their world from his, each step heavier than the last. The city changed as they walked. Potholes disappeared, the roads grew smoother, and the air carried the sharp scent of imported perfumes instead of sweat and smoke. Towering buildings of glass and steel mirrored the sun, making Aisha squint as though she were staring into another universe. When they finally reached the restaurant, its gleaming signboard read Adewale's Place, and the entrance was adorned with palm trees wrapped in fairy lights even though it was still broad daylight. Aisha hesitated at the gate, her heart thudding as a uniformed security guard approached. "Madam, what can you find here?" he asked, his voice a mixture of boredom and suspicion. "Please," she said, her hands trembling as she tightened her grip on Musa. We only want the leftovers. For my children." The guard's face hardened. "You can't stand here. Go beg somewhere else." Tears burned her eyes, but before she could plead further, the heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open, and out stepped a tall man in a white agbada that shimmered like it had been woven from light itself. His skin was the deep brown of roasted kola, his beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes, sharp, calculating but unexpectedly warm, landed on the small family huddled by the gate. Chief Adewale had come out to take a private call, his mind buzzing with plans for an international business deal, but something about the scene froze him mid-step. Perhaps it was the way Musa stood defiantly, shielding his sister with his thin frame, or the way Aisha's back remained straight despite her trembling knees, as though poverty could bend her but not break her. For a long moment, he simply stared, and they stared back, 3 lives colliding with his like stones hitting the surface of still water. Then Zainab, in a voice so soft it seemed carried by the wind, said, "Please, sir. Can we have your leftovers?" Adewale blinked, the words slicing through his thoughts with a strange, unexpected force. He had given millions to charities, signed checks without thinking, and attended galas where poverty was discussed like a distant tragedy, but never had hunger looked him in the eye and spoken so simply. He turned slightly, catching his reflection in the glass door, and for the first time in years, he wondered what all his wealth truly meant. The guard began to wave them away, muttering about disturbances, but Adewale raised a hand to stop him. "Bring them in," he said, his voice low but commanding, the kind that made people obey without question. Aisha's breath caught. She wasn't sure if stepping through those doors would save them or humiliate them further, but when Musa squeezed her hand and whispered, "Mama, maybe this is it," she nodded slowly, hope flickering like a candle against the wind. And as they stepped into the cool, perfumed air of Adewale's place, none of them realized that this moment, the request for leftovers, was about to change everything they thought they knew about hunger, dignity, and the unpredictable kindness of strangers. The air inside Adewale's place was so cold and fragrant that Aisha felt her skin prickle as though she had stepped into another reality, one where hunger and dust did not exist, where plates gleamed like mirrors and chairs were soft enough to swallow your tired bones. Musa and Zainab stared wide-eyed at the cascading chandelier above them, its crystals scattering sunlight into tiny rainbows across the polished marble floor, while waiters in crisp uniforms glided past carrying trays that smelled like heaven had been cooked and served on porcelain. For a moment, Aisha wanted to turn back. She did not belong here, and she feared that any second someone would grab her by the arm and throw her out into the hot, merciless street. But Chief Adewale walked ahead of them with the easy authority of a man who owned not just the building but the air they breathed, and people stepped aside to let him pass, their curious stares bouncing between him and the ragged family trailing at his heels. At a corner table by the window, he motioned for them to sit, and though Aisha hesitated, she obeyed, her calloused fingers clutching the edge of the seat as though it might reject her weight. A waiter approached nervously, unsure how to treat these unlikely guests, but Adewale's voice cut through his hesitation like a blade. "Bring them food. Everything fresh. And water." The words sounded ordinary, but to Aisha they rang like a royal decree, a command that tilted her world on its axis. When the food arrived, plates piled high with smoky jollof rice, fried chicken glistening with spice, plantains so golden they looked like sunlight you could eat, Musa and Zainab froze, their bodies torn between hunger and disbelief. "Go on," Adewale said, his tone softer now. "It's for you." And then, as though the spell had broken, the children devoured the meal with the desperate grace of those who know what it means to starve but refuse to lose their dignity. Aisha, however, could not eat. Her hands trembled around the glass of water, her throat tight with questions she did not dare ask. Why was this man helping them? What did he want? People like him didn't notice people like her unless there was something to gain, and she had nothing to give except the stories etched into her skin like scars. Adewale watched them in silence, something shifting behind his eyes. He had grown up in wealth, his father a shipping magnate whose empire stretched across continents, and though he prided himself on being self-made, building restaurants, hotels, and real estate portfolios, he realized in that moment how insulated his life had been. Charity galas and donations had allowed him to feel generous without getting his hands dirty, but here, across the table from three human beings whose hunger was not a statistic but a living thing, he felt a discomfort that was both unsettling and strangely liberating. "What's your name?" he asked finally. His voice low enough that it carried no command, only curiosity. "Aisha," she replied, her tone cautious, as though even her name might be too much to offer. "And them?" "Musa and Zainab." She paused, her gaze flickering toward the children. "Their father is gone." Adewale didn't push further, but something in her voice, the way it cracked but did not crumble, made him want to know everything. He leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin, and studied her. "What do you do?" he asked. "I sew," she said, almost in a whisper, as though ashamed of a skill that had once been her pride. "I had a shop. But," her words faltered, and Musa, his mouth still full of rice, blurted out, "The landlord took it." Zainab nodded solemnly, adding, "And now Mama makes clothes at home, but nobody pays much." A flicker of amusement passed through Adewale's eyes at their blunt honesty, but it was quickly replaced by something heavier, an ache he hadn't expected. Before he could respond, a tall, lean man in a tailored suit approached their table. "Chief," he said with a tight smile, "a word." It was Kunal, Adewale's operations manager, a man who believed rules were sacred and appearances even more so. Adewale excused himself and stepped aside, but the conversation wasn't as private as Kunal thought. "Sir," Kunal began, "this display might send the wrong message. Customers are already staring. Allowing street beggars in here, it's not good for business." Adewale's jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping across the restaurant where indeed several diners had paused mid-bite to gawk at the scene like it was an exotic performance. For a fleeting second, Adewale considered retreating to the safe distance of wealth, where people like Aisha were kept neatly out of sight. But then he saw Musa wiping his sister's mouth with the edge of his own shirt, and he realized retreat was no longer an option. "They're not beggars," he said finally, his tone cool and deliberate. "They're my guests. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take their appetite elsewhere." Kunal blinked, stunned into silence, as Adewale returned to the table with a new resolve simmering in his chest. "Do you want to go back to sewing?" he asked Aisha, as though they had been mid-conversation the whole time. Her eyes widened, her lips parting to respond, but no words came. She had learned long ago not to dream beyond survival, and now this stranger was asking her to imagine something bigger. "Yes," she said finally, the words sounding both fragile and fierce. Adewale nodded slowly, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Good. Then eat. Tomorrow we talk." And though Aisha didn't understand what tomorrow could possibly bring, for the first time in years she felt a flicker of something that wasn't just hope. It was the terrifying, intoxicating possibility of change. The next morning, Aisha woke to the sound of Musa and Zainab whispering excitedly beside her, their voices dancing with the kind of hope she hadn't heard in years, and though her body was still stiff from sleeping on the hard wooden floor of their single-room shack, she found herself smiling before she even opened her eyes. The memory of yesterday, of cold air, crystal lights and food so rich it felt like a dream, lingered like a sweet aftertaste, but reality pressed in quickly. The cracked walls around her, the thin mat beneath her, the market noise already starting outside their window. She told herself not to expect anything more. Men like Chief Adewale moved through life like storms, fierce, transformative, but rarely lingering long enough to nurture what they touched. Still, when she saw him waiting by a black SUV parked at the edge of their street later that day, dressed casually in a white kaftan and sandals as though he were any other man, her heart skipped like a stone across water. He had come alone, no entourage, no cameras, and the sight of him standing amidst the chaos of their slum, where children played barefoot in muddy puddles and women balanced buckets of water on their heads, was so surreal that people stopped what they were doing to stare. "Morning," he said simply, as though they were old friends meeting for a stroll. And though Aisha could barely form a response, Musa and Zainab waved shyly, their faces glowing with recognition. Adewale walked with them through the neighborhood, asking questions in a voice that carried neither pity nor judgment. How much did it cost to reopen a shop? Where did she source her fabrics? Who were her customers before? At first Aisha answered stiffly, expecting his interest to fade, but the more she spoke, the more she realized he was listening, truly listening, as though her dreams were not just idle chatter but blueprints worth building upon. "You're good at what you do," he said finally, after examining a dress she had hand-stitched for Zainab from scraps of Ankara fabric. "But skill without opportunity is like a bird with broken wings." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, but something about his words planted itself deep inside her, like a seed waiting for rain. Over the next week, Adewale visited often, sometimes bringing food, sometimes bringing nothing but conversation, and though whispers began to circulate in both their worlds, they couldn't have been more different. In Aisha's neighborhood, people speculated wildly. Some believed he was a distant relative, others thought he had fallen in love with her, and a few cynical voices muttered about men who used kindness as bait. In Adewale's world, Kunal and the other executives grumbled about his distractions, fearing that sentiment would cloud the sharp instincts that had made him a millionaire. "You can't save everyone, Chief," Kunal argued one evening as they reviewed quarterly reports. "And people like her, once you start giving, they'll never stop taking." Adewale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared out the window of his office where the city stretched like a living mosaic, glass towers reflecting the sun, slums crouched like shadows beneath their glow. "Maybe that's the problem," he said finally. "We've convinced ourselves that giving is weakness when it's actually the only strength that matters." Kunal frowned, unsure how to respond, and Adewale waved him off, his mind already forming a plan. 2 weeks later, Aisha stood in front of a small shop in Balagan Market. her hands trembling as she held the new keys Adewale had placed in her palm. The shop wasn't lavish, but it was bright and clean, with sturdy shelves for fabric and a sewing machine so modern she was almost afraid to touch it. Musa and Zainab ran circles around the room, their laughter ricocheting off the walls like music, while Adewale leaned casually against the doorframe, watching her reaction with quiet satisfaction. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. It had been haunting her since the day he brought them into his restaurant, gnawing at the edges of her gratitude like a persistent rat. Adewale paused, his expression unreadable, then shrugged lightly. "Because once, a stranger did it for me," he said, and though he didn't elaborate, the shadow that passed over his face told her there was a story buried there, one she might never fully know. But not everyone celebrated this new chapter. 2 weeks after her shop opened, a group of market women began whispering about how unfair it was that an outsider had received such generosity while they, who had been struggling in the market for years, got nothing. Their resentment found a leader in Madame Saad, a wealthy fabric seller who prided herself on controlling the market's hierarchy. One afternoon, as Aisha arranged her fabrics, Saad strode into the shop with 2 of her apprentices and sneered. "Enjoying your charity, eh? Let's see how long you last without him holding your hand." Aisha, though shaken, stood tall. "I'm here to work, not to compete," she said, her voice steady even as her knees quivered. But Saad wasn't done. She began spreading rumors that Aisha was Adewale's mistress, that her success wasn't earned but bought, and soon the whispers became sharp enough to cut. When Adewale heard about it, he confronted Saad directly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "If you have a problem with her," he said, "you have a problem with me." The confrontation silenced the market for days, but it also revealed something Aisha hadn't realized until then. Helping her wasn't just changing her life, it was challenging the fragile balance of power that kept people like her small and people like Saad untouchable. That night, as she sat on the floor of her room with Musa and Zainab curled beside her, she realized something else too. Change wasn't just about opportunity, it was about courage. The courage to face envy, to hold on to dignity, and to believe that she was worthy of the life she was beginning to build. And though she didn't know it yet, that courage would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine, because kindness, as she was about to learn, had a cost even a millionaire couldn't always control. It began with a storm, not the kind that split the sky with thunder, but the kind that brewed quietly in the hearts of people who felt threatened by change. 3 months after Aisha's shop had opened, business was thriving in ways she had never dared to dream. Women came from different parts of Lagos to buy her designs, praising her for the creativity that seemed to pour from her hands like water from a blessed spring. Musa and Zainab, their cheeks rounder and their laughter louder, had started school again, carrying with them the quiet pride of children who finally belonged somewhere. Even the tiny room they called home had begun to transform. With Adewale's help, she had repaired the leaking roof and painted the walls a warm, hopeful yellow. Yet as her life grew brighter, shadows thickened around her. Madame Saada's resentment, once a nuisance, turned into a vendetta. She rallied other traders who feared that Aisha's sudden success might attract more outsiders to the market, threatening their dominance. And together they concocted a plan that was as cruel as it was calculated. One Saturday morning, as Aisha prepared to open her shop, she found the lock broken and the inside of her store in shambles. Fabrics slashed to ribbons, sewing machines overturned, and a crude message scrawled on the wall in charcoal. "Go back to begging." The sight stole her breath like a punch to the chest, and for a moment she thought she might collapse right there on the market floor. Musa and Zainab stood frozen beside her, their small faces pale with shock, until Musa clenched his fists and said through gritted teeth, "We can fix it, Mama. We won't give up." His words, though fierce, made her heart ache even more, because she knew how fragile their new life still was. When Adewale arrived later that day and saw the destruction, his expression darkened in a way she had never seen before. "Who did this?" he demanded. His voice low but dangerous, the kind of voice that made grown men tremble. Aisha, however, touched his arm gently and shook her head. "If we fight them with anger," she said softly, "we'll become like them." Her restraint baffled him, but it also impressed him. And in that moment he realized that strength wasn't always loud. It was sometimes the quiet decision to rebuild when everything inside you screamed to destroy. But rebuilding wouldn't be easy. The rumors Madame Saad had spread grew louder after the attack, twisting the story into something ugly. Some said Aisha had staged the incident to gain more sympathy. Others claimed Adewale was using her as a pawn to take over the market. Investors in Adewale's restaurant chain began to question his judgment, with Kunal warning him, "This is spiraling out of control, Chief. You're risking everything for one woman's dream." Adewale looked at him steadily and replied, "If everything I've built can't survive doing the right thing, then maybe it's not worth keeping." With his support, Aisha reopened the shop within 2 weeks, this time stronger than before. Adewale insisted on installing security cameras and hiring guards, but more importantly, he organized a market-wide meeting where he addressed the traders directly. Standing on a wooden platform under the blazing Lagos sun, he spoke not as a millionaire but as a man who believed in fairness. "This market belongs to all of us," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "Success is not a limited pot of soup. Her rise does not mean your fall. If you can't celebrate someone else's progress, then you are your own enemy." The words rippled through the crowd like wind bending tall grass, and though not everyone was convinced, something in the air shifted. Madame Saad, standing at the back with her arms folded, realized that her power was slipping, not because Adewale had money, but because Aisha had earned something more enduring: respect. Over the next few months, customers began to seek out Aisha not just for her clothes but for her story, seeing in her resilience a reflection of their own struggles. Adewale, too, found himself transformed. What began as an act of charity had become a partnership that challenged his understanding of wealth. Through Aisha, he saw that true riches weren't measured by the weight of your bank account but by the lives you could lift alongside your own. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting everything in hues of gold and fire, Aisha invited him to share a simple meal in her now-repaired home: beans, plantains, and a small bottle of malt. Musa and Zainab, giggling, insisted on serving him themselves, and Adewale laughed in a way that startled even him, a sound so unguarded it felt like a release. "You've changed everything," he said quietly as they ate, but Aisha shook her head. "No," she replied, her eyes shining with a calm strength. "You only reminded me that I could change it myself." And as the night settled softly around them, with laughter spilling into the streets and the scent of cooking fires drifting through the air, it became clear that the moment Zainab had asked, "Can we have your leftovers?" had never been about food at all. It had been about awakening, theirs and his, and the understanding that kindness, when given without condition, doesn't just fill empty stomachs. It rebuilds broken worlds.